By the time the knife cut through the pork shoulder, nobody in the Blackwater County Fair Hall was talking anymore. The old farmer stood near the back wall in a faded canvas coat, his hands buried deep in the pockets like he already regretted coming. Across the room, chefs, livestock buyers, brewery executives, and county officials stared down at their plates in complete silence. Then the oldest butcher in Cedar Hollow slowly set down his fork and whispered something nobody expected to hear in 2026. "That's the flavor my grandfather used to talk about." For a few seconds, even the refrigeration fan sounded loud. 14 years earlier, people laughed every time a rusted brewery truck dumped steaming piles of spent grain along Elias Boone's fence line. They called it pig slop. Said his farm smelled like spoiled beer and wet hay. Said nobody with a brain still raised heritage hogs anymore. But standing in that crowded hall, with the taste of his pork still hanging in the air, the same people who mocked him could no longer pretend the old man had been crazy. If you're listening from a back road, a small town, or someplace where people still remember the smell of fresh-cut hay after rain, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. And if stories about old farms, stubborn people, and forgotten American places still matter to you, consider subscribing before we head back to the fall when Blackwater County almost lost Boone Hollow Farm for good. 14 years before the tasting hall fell silent, most people in Cedar Hollow only knew Boone Hollow Farm by its smell. On damp mornings, the scent drifted low across Miller Road like warm beer soaked into old straw. By noon, especially during late August heat, it settled over the ditch lines and soybean fields thick enough to make passing drivers roll up their windows. The brewery trucks came every afternoon except Sundays. They rattled down the gravel road behind Hearth River Brewing, carrying steaming loads of spent mash grain left over from beer production. The grain still smoked in cold weather. In summer, it fermented before sunset. Nobody understood why Elias Boone wanted it. "Man's feeding pigs garbage," Vernon Pike liked to say every Friday morning at Calhoun Feed and Grain. "Whole county smells like a busted tavern because of him." Most folks laughed. A few quietly agreed. Elias rarely answered any of them. At 63, he had the heavy shoulders of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying feed buckets through snow instead of talking his way through problems. His beard had gone mostly gray years ago, and arthritis made his right hand stiff whenever rain moved in from the west. But every afternoon, just before the brewery truck arrived, he still walked the same muddy path out to the fence line carrying a rusted iron bell. The hogs heard it before the truck even turned onto Boone Hollow Road. Deep black Berkshire hogs and long-bodied red wattles lifted their heads from the mud almost immediately. Then came the noise, grunts, squeals, and hundreds of pounds of movement rolling through the old oak feeding lots. Elias rang the bell once. "That's enough." His granddaughter Harper called from the porch one evening. "They already know you're coming." "Maybe," Elias answered without looking back. But good hogs remember routines same as people. Harper Boone was 17 and already counting the months until graduation. She loved the farm in the complicated way people loved, places they feared getting trapped inside forever. Some mornings she photographed the fog rolling across the pasture because she thought Boone Hollow looked beautiful. Other mornings she stared at the collapsing machine shed and wondered why her grandfather refused to let the place die peacefully. The old man had been stubborn for longer than she'd been alive. Maybe longer. Inside the barn office sat a cracked wooden desk stacked with feed invoices, veterinary receipts, and a thick leather notebook stained dark from years of grain dust and wet fingerprints. Every few pages carried handwritten notes beside dates and weather temperatures. October mash sweeter after first frost. Porter grain too heavy for spring feed. Good hogs remember what they eat. The sentence appeared over and over in Elias Boone's rough handwriting. Nobody besides Harper had ever read the notebook carefully. Then, one gray Tuesday in late October, 3 black SUVs rolled through the gates of Hearth River Brewing just after sunrise. By supper time, the entire county had heard the rumor. The brewery was being sold, and for the first time in 14 years, Elias Boone stood silently beside his fence line, watching the spent grain trucks, and wondering whether tomorrow they would still come at all. The first thing Gideon Vale noticed about Boone Hollow Farm was the mud, not the hogs, not the smell, not even the leaning red barns with rust bleeding through old tin roofing. Just the mud. He stepped carefully out of the black SUV in polished brown boots that had probably never crossed a livestock lot before that morning. The October wind carried the sharp scent of wet grain across the pasture, while several Berkshire hogs pushed against the fencing nearby, watching the strangers with small dark eyes. Gideon studied the feed trenches with visible disapproval. "Runoff control," he asked. Elias Boone kept both hands buried inside his coat pockets. "Ditch carries east." "That wasn't my question." Harper stood near the porch rail holding a notebook against her chest. She could already tell the man disliked the farm before speaking to anybody on it. 3 other corporate employees moved behind him with tablets and cameras, photographing everything from the fermentation barrels to the drainage culvert near the lower hog lot. The brewery sale had officially closed 48 hours earlier. Hearth River Brewing now belonged to Mid-Central Beverage Holdings out of Minneapolis, and Gideon Vale had been sent to evaluate operational liabilities. That was the phrase everyone in town kept repeating. Operational liabilities. As if people's lives could be folded neatly into accounting language. "We've inherited several informal disposal agreements," Gideon explained, while one employee snapped photos of the grain piles steaming beside the fence. "The company is reviewing all of them." Elias stared toward the road instead of at him. "They ain't disposal," he said quietly. "That mash feeds livestock." Gideon gave a polite smile that somehow felt colder than open disrespect. "Yes, Mr. Boone. I'm aware that's how you've been using it." Using it. The words settled badly in Harper's stomach. Like the spent grain had never mattered beyond saving the brewery money. One of the younger inspectors wrinkled her nose near the feed trench. "How often is this cleaned?" "Every morning. With equipment. With a shovel." The woman stopped writing after that. By late afternoon, the county had already started talking. News spread fast in Cedar Hollow, especially once people saw the black SUVs parked outside the brewery gates all week. Sumba. At Calhoun Feed and Grain, Vernon Pike leaned across the coffee counter and shook his head. "Told you," he muttered to the mechanic beside him. "Corporate boys'll shut that slop operation down inside 6 months." Across town, Naomi Rusk from First Prairie Bank sat in her office reviewing Boone Hollow's refinancing file for the 3rd time in 2 years. The numbers never looked good for long. Feed costs climbed. Heritage livestock sold slowly. Repair bills kept growing. Only the spent grain arrangement had kept Elias afloat during bad seasons. And now even that looked uncertain. That evening, Harper climbed the loft ladder inside the old machine shed carrying 2 buckets of commercial feed pellets she had bought in town without telling Elias. "We should at least try mixing it in," she said carefully. Elias sat sharpening a rusted skinning knife beneath a dim yellow light bulb. "They won't touch it." "They might if they get hungry enough." "They ain't feedlot hogs." Harper exhaled hard. "Grandpa, this isn't 1978 anymore." For several seconds, the only sound came from rain tapping softly against the tin roof overhead. Then Elias stood, grabbed 1 handful of pellets, and walked toward the feeding lot without another word. The hogs crowded the troughs immediately once he rang the old iron bell. Steam rose from their backs in the cold evening air, while Harper poured the pellets carefully across the fermented grain mix. At first, the animals sniffed cautiously. Then one large Berkshire sow backed away completely. Another nudged the pellets aside with its snout. Within minutes, half the trough sat untouched. Elias looked down into the feed silently. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap. And for the first time since the brewery sale, something close to fear finally reached his eyes. The next morning, Harper found Elias in the feed room before sunrise, standing over the old leather notebook with a pencil tucked behind his ear. The barn smelled of sour grain, wood smoke, damp straw, and something warmer underneath it, all the deep animal heat of hogs sleeping close through a cold Wisconsin night. Outside, frost silvered the fence rails. Inside. Elias turned page after page without speaking. Harper leaned against the doorway. You ever think maybe people don't understand this because you never explain it? Elias did not look up. People don't pay much for explanations. They might pay for proof. That made him pause. The notebook was older than Harper had realized. The first pages were written by her great-grandfather, Elias Boone, who had come home from a brewery job in Milwaukee with ideas nobody in Blackwater County understood. He had believed barley mash, if handled right, could feed hogs better than cheap corn alone. Not dumped wet and rotting, not shoveled carelessly, balanced, turned, cooled, fermented just long enough. Elias ran one stiff finger along a faded line. My father used to say hogs carry memory in their fat. Harper frowned. That sounds made up. Most true things do, first time you hear them. By noon, she followed him through the process with her phone camera recording in her coat pocket. Elias mixed warm spent grain with cracked oats, apple scraps from a neighbor's orchard, mineral salt, and a small scoop of dried yeast he kept in a blue coffee can. He checked texture by squeezing it in his hand. He judged warmth by pressing his wrist against the barrel. He smelled each batch before feeding it. Harper expected guesswork. What she saw looked closer to a language. Every movement had a reason. Every barrel had a date. Every hog lot received a slightly different mix. That sow by the far gate, Elias said. She gets less porter grain. Makes her sluggish. How do you know that? She told me. Harper almost laughed until she realized he meant it. That Saturday, Boone Hollow took 3 hogs to the Cedar Hollow County Fair Livestock Row. The fairgrounds smelled of fried onions, diesel exhaust, kettle corn, and damp sawdust. Kids ran between show pens with paper numbers pinned to their shirts. Farmers leaned on gates pretending not to compare animals. Then Vernon Pike saw Elias backing his trailer into the heritage livestock section. Well, I'll be, Vernon called loudly. The beer pigs made it to town. A few men chuckled. Someone made a joke about tasting like tavern floor. Harper felt her face burn. Elias just lowered the ramp. The Berkshire hog stepped down slow and heavy, black coat shining even under the gray sky. For a moment, the laughter thinned. The animal was broader than most expected, calm-eyed and solid, with the kind of weight that came from patient feeding, not hurried growth. Near the end of the row, a small butcher named Milo Kessler watched without smiling. He had cut meat in Cedar Hollow for 40 years and rarely praised anything in public. That afternoon, after the judging, Milo walked to Elias's pen and looked over the hog again. What are you feeding him? He asked. Elias gave the answer everybody expected. Grain. Milo's eyes narrowed. That ain't what I asked. Before Elias could respond, Harper noticed a tall stranger near the fence line, wearing a wool coat too fine for a county fair. He was holding a paper-wrapped pork sample from Milo's booth and staring at it like it had spoken to him. Then one of the younger red wattle hogs in Elias's pen suddenly staggered sideways, hit the rail hard, and dropped into the sawdust. For one long second, nobody moved, fuss. Then Harper jumped the rail. The red wattle lay on its side in the sawdust, breathing hard, its legs kicking weakly like it was trying to run from something in a dream. Fairgoers gathered fast. Children were pulled back by their parents. Vernon Pike stopped laughing. Even Milo Kessler stepped away from his booth with his apron still on. Elias knelt beside the hog and pressed one hand against its neck. "Easy," he whispered. "Easy now." The county veterinarian, Dr. Lena Hart, arrived from the dairy barn with a black bag in one hand and worry already written across her face. Disease was the one word no livestock man wanted spoken aloud at a county fair. It traveled faster than gossip and ruined harder than debt. "Clear this aisle," she said. Within minutes, the fair officials had yellow rope around Elias's pens. By evening, Boone Hollow's trailer sat alone at the edge of the fairgrounds while every other farmer loaded animals under watchful, nervous eyes. A county inspector named Paul Danner stood with a clipboard, asking Elias where the hogs had come from, what they had eaten, and whether any commercial feed had recently been introduced. Harper felt her stomach sink. Commercial pellets. The 2 buckets she had bought? Elias looked at her only once. Not angry. Worse. Tired. By Monday morning, 3 county trucks rolled into Boone Hollow Farm. Inspectors photographed the feed trenches, tested standing water near the lower ditch, and took samples from the fermentation barrels. One man scraped black mud from beside the fence line into a plastic container, as though he were collecting evidence from a crime scene. Gideon Vale arrived an hour later. He did not smile this time. "I'm sorry, Mr. Boone," he said, holding a folder beneath his arm. "But until this investigation is complete, Mid-Central Beverage is suspending all spent grain transfers to your property." Elias stared at the empty place beside the fence where the brewery truck usually backed in. "You don't even know what made that hog sick." "No," Gideon said, "but I know what liability looks like." The words landed harder than shouting would have. That afternoon, Naomi Rusk from First Prairie Bank called to say the refinancing committee had reviewed his file again. Her voice was gentle, but gentleness did not change the answer. Without stable feed supply and without proof the herd was clean, the bank could not extend further credit. Harper sat across from Elias at the kitchen table while the receiver rested between them. The house felt colder than usual. On Tuesday, Elias drove to Harper & Sons Equipment and sold the old farmall that had belonged to his father. It was a faded red 1949 model with cracked rubber tires, a patched seat, and a dent in the hood from the year Elias had backed it into the smokehouse door during a snowstorm. Harper had never seen him cry, and he did not cry then. He just stood in the gravel lot watching a young mechanic chain the tractor to a flatbed. The money bought hay, veterinary tests, and enough replacement feed for 3 weeks. Not 4. That night, Harper found the old leather feed journal missing from the barn office. For a moment, panic rose in her throat. Then she saw it tucked under Elias's pillow in the room where he had slept alone since her grandmother died. The next morning, while Elias was out checking water lines, Harper opened her phone and saw a headline from 2 counties over: "Industrial Hog Facilities Report. Respiratory Outbreak After Feed Change." She read it once, then again. And somewhere outside, beyond the kitchen window, one of the Boone hogs rang the loose gate chain like a warning bell. Harper did not show Elias the article right away. She printed it first at the public library because the farm printer had been out of ink since August. Then she drove home with the paper folded inside her coat. The words industrial outbreak and feed transition burning through her like a secret too heavy to carry alone. Dr. Lena Hart returned to Boone Hollow 2 days later with test results and a different look in her eyes. It wasn't contagious, she said. Elias stood beside the lower hog lot, one hand gripping the fence rail. Then what was it? Digestive shock. Most likely, stress response from abrupt feed change. Harper looked down. Lena noticed but did not embarrass her. The animal recovered because you caught it fast, she continued, and because your herd is healthier than I expected. Elias said nothing. Lena stepped closer to the feeding trench and watched several Berkshire hogs root through the sour mash mix he had stretched thin with oats and leftover apples. I've inspected plenty of hog operations. Elias, I'm not saying your way is pretty, but these animals have strong gut health, good coats, calm behavior, better respiratory scores than some operations 10 times this size. That was the first kind word anyone official had said about Boone Hollow in weeks. Harper felt it like sunlight breaking through a dirty window. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the leather feed journal open beside her laptop. Page by page, she typed her grandfather's notes into a spreadsheet. She copied dates, temperatures, grain types, yeast measurements, weather patterns, and the old remarks written in the margins. Porter mash in cold weeks. Wheat beer grain for young stock. Never feed hot mash before rain. Good hogs remember what they eat. Elias came in from the barn and stopped when he saw what she was doing. That book ain't for the internet. I'm not putting the book online, Harper said. I'm showing people there's a method. People don't care. Maybe the wrong people don't. She uploaded a short video just before midnight. It showed Elias turning fermented mash in an oak barrel with steam rising around his shoulders. It showed the hogs coming to the bell, slow and steady, not frantic like feedlot animals. It showed Harper's hand flipping through the old notes without revealing every page. By morning, the video had been shared by a local restaurant page in Madison. By afternoon, a culinary history group had reposted it. By Friday, Milo Kessler called to say 3 chefs had asked whether Boone Hollow pork could be ordered. Elias did not smile when Harper told him. He looked almost offended by the idea of strangers caring suddenly. Where were they 14 years ago? Harper lowered her voice. Maybe they didn't know where to look. The first call from Lucian Ward came while Elias was repairing a frozen water line behind the smokehouse. Lucian was a chef from Chicago, though his voice sounded older and quieter than Harper expected. He said he had tasted a sample from Milo's shop at the county fair. He said there was something in the fat he had not tasted since his apprenticeship under an old butcher from Iowa. Elias took the phone only after Harper insisted. He listened for nearly a minute. Then his jaw tightened. No, he said, we're not a story for your menu. He handed the phone back and walked outside. That evening, the black SUV returned. Gideon Vale stepped out alone this time, carrying a clean folder and wearing boots better suited for mud. I'll be direct, he told Elias. Mid-Central is prepared to make an offer for the full property. Harper looked from Gideon to her grandfather. Elias did not answer, but his eyes moved, just once, toward the empty machine shed where the farmall used to sit. Snow came early to Blackwater County that year. By the second week of November, Boone Hollow Farm looked smaller beneath the weather fences half buried in white drifts, smoke rolling thin from the old stone smokehouse, and the hog lots frozen hard enough to crack beneath heavy boots. Elias spent longer hours alone after Gideon Vale's offer, not because he was considering it. At least that was what Harper told herself. But every morning she found him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the unsigned paperwork beside his coffee cup. 40 acres near the county road alone were worth more money than the farm had seen in decades. Mid-Central wanted warehouse access beside the brewery expansion project, distribution routes, loading yards, efficiency. Corporate words. Words that sounded clean until they reached places like Cedar Hollow. Then, 3 days before Thanksgiving, a dusty blue pickup rolled slowly into Boone Hollow's driveway. Harper recognized the truck before the driver stepped out. Her father. Daniel Boone had not spent more than 2 nights at the farm in almost 8 years. He looked older than Harper remembered. Leaner? City-tired? His coat smelled faintly of machine oil and cold highway air as he walked toward the porch where Elias stood feeding wood into the stove box. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Daniel finally said, "Heard you're thinking about selling?" Elias closed the stove door harder than necessary. People in town talk too much. Maybe because they're worried. Worried about me or worried about land prices? Daniel ignored the question. You can't keep running this place like it's still 1985. The words landed harder than Gideon's ever had. Harper stayed silent near the doorway while old anger slowly filled the kitchen like smoke trapped under a ceiling. You left, Elias said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Yeah, I did. You left because you were ashamed of this farm. No, Daniel snapped. I left because this farm swallowed everything around it. The room went still. Outside, wind pushed snow against the porch windows in soft, scraping waves. Daniel looked at Harper before speaking again. Mom was sick, and you still spent nights out there checking hog feed temperatures. Elias stared at the floorboards. You think I forgot that? No, Daniel answered. I think you survived it by pretending the farm mattered more. Harper had never heard anyone speak to her grandfather that way. For the first time in her life, Elias Boone looked old. Not stubborn. Not proud. Just tired. That night, after Daniel went to town for motel rooms neither man could afford comfortably, Harper found Elias sitting inside the smokehouse alone. Thin ribbons of hickory smoke drifted through the rafters, while cured pork shoulders hung from iron hooks overhead like shadows from another century. On the work table sat an old black and white photograph. Elias as a boy, his father beside him. The original farmel parked behind them. He's not wrong about all of it, Elias said without looking up. Harper sat carefully across from him. You stayed. Sometimes staying costs more than leaving. The old carving knife rested near his hand, its wooden handle polished smooth by generations of Boone men before him. After several minutes, Elias spoke again. If I sell, maybe you get a chance at something easier. Harper felt anger rise so quickly it surprised her. You think I stayed because I got trapped here? No, Elias said softly. I think you stayed because you felt sorry for me. She stood up so fast the chair legs scraped stone. That's not fair. Neither's this place. Harper left the smokehouse before he could see tears forming in her eyes. The next morning, Elias was halfway through chores when a dark green SUV pulled into the frozen yard. A tall man stepped out carrying 2 insulated coolers and wearing a wool coat dusted with road salt. Lucian Ward had arrived at Boone Hollow Farm in person. Lucian Ward did not look like the kind of man who belonged in a frozen hog yard. His wool coat was too fine, his leather gloves too clean, and the scarf tucked neatly around his neck seemed better suited for a restaurant doorway than a Wisconsin farm where the wind could cut through denim before breakfast. Still, he stepped out of the SUV and stood quietly for a moment, taking in the barns, the smokehouse, the empty place beside the machine shed where a tractor had once sat, and the long fence line where the brewery grain used to steam in winter air. Elias met him near the gate. If you came for a tour, you picked a bad week. Lucian looked toward the hog lots. I came because I tasted something I thought was gone. Elias's face hardened. Meat is meat. No, Lucian said softly. That's what people say after they forget. Harper, standing on the porch with her arms crossed tight against the cold, saw her grandfather flinch at the sentence. Not much, just enough. Inside the kitchen, Lucian opened one of the coolers and removed 3 wrapped samples. It was supermarket pork. One came from a modern premium supplier. The third was from Milo Kessler's cut of Boone Hollow shoulder. Daniel had returned from the motel by then, and he watched the whole thing with suspicion from beside the stove. Lucian heated each piece in a cast-iron skillet without seasoning beyond salt. No sauce. No herbs. Nothing to hide behind. The smell changed first. The supermarket cut tightened and paled in the pan. The premium pork browned nicely enough, giving off a clean but ordinary scent. Then the Boone pork began to render slowly, and the kitchen filled with something deeper smoke. Barley, sweet fat, oak, apple skin, and the faint bitter warmth of dark beer mash. Nobody spoke. Even Daniel looked away from the window. Lucian placed small pieces on plain plates. Elias did not touch his. Harper did. The flavor was familiar and strange at the same time, like the farm had somehow become food. The smokehouse rafters, the old barrels, the orchard scraps, the bell at dusk, the spent grain steaming beside the fence in February. Lucian watched her face carefully. That, he said, is not nostalgia. That is method. From his satchel, he pulled a folder filled with photocopies old Midwestern butcher records, agricultural extension notes from the 1930s, immigrant farm journals, photographs of hogs raised behind breweries before industrial feed systems took over. These flavors disappeared because the systems that created them disappeared, Lucian said. Small breweries, mixed feed, slow-growing breeds, outdoor lots, smokehouses that weren't designed by marketing departments. Elias gave a humorless laugh. You talk pretty. I'm not here to flatter you. Then what do you want? Lucian tapped the leather feed journal sitting on the table between them. I want you to let people see this before they bulldoze the last proof. The room went quiet. Daniel shifted uneasily. Harper looked at her grandfather, expecting refusal. For years, Elias had guarded that notebook like it contained the family's last private language. It carried his father's handwriting, his own grief, and the proof that staying had meant something more than stubbornness. Finally, Elias touched the cover with 2 stiff fingers. My wife used to say I loved this farm because I didn't know how to love people right. Nobody answered. Outside, the wind moved through the bare maples behind the smokehouse. Lucian lowered his voice. There's a heritage food showcase in Blackwater County next month. Chefs, buyers, state agriculture people, local press. Bring the pork. Bring the journal. Let them taste what 14 years built. Before Elias could answer, Harper's phone buzzed on the counter. She read the email twice, then looked up pale. Mid-Central Beverage had officially terminated all spent grain access to Boone Hollow Farm, effective immediately. The first morning without brewery grain felt wrong before anyone said it. No truck rattled down Boone Hollow Road. No warm mash steamed beside the fence. No heavy sour-sweet smell rose into the cold air while the hogs gathered near the gate, waiting for the sound they had known most of their lives. Elias rang the bell anyway. The animals came, but slower than before. He mixed oats, hay meal, apples, and the last scrapings from the fermentation barrels. It filled the troughs, but it did not carry the same warmth. The hogs ate enough to live, not enough to settle. By the 3rd day, their coats looked duller. By the 5th, the old Berkshire sow near the far gate began pacing the fence line at dusk. Harper noticed everything. She wrote it down the way Elias had taught her without admitting he had taught her. Feed taken lower. Temperament restless. Weight gain uncertain. Flavor risk unknown. At night, she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts, county maps, veterinary notes, brewery records, and photos from the drainage ditch behind the hog lots. If Mid-Central wanted to call Boone Hollow a liability, she wanted numbers ready when the county hearing came. Daniel watched her from across the room. "You look like your grandfather when you do that," he said. Harper did not look up. "That's supposed to be an insult." "No." His voice softened. "Not this time." The hearing was held in the Blackwater County Administration Building on a Thursday evening, with snow packed along the curb outside and half the town squeezed into folding chairs inside. Gideon Vale arrived with charts, binders, and 2 environmental consultants. Naomi Rusk sat near the back, her bank coat still buttoned, eyes lowered toward her lap. Elias wore his brown canvas coat and said almost nothing. Gideon spoke first. He explained liability exposure, runoff uncertainty, food safety perception, rural development opportunity, and the warehouse jobs Mid-Central could help bring to Cedar Hollow. He did not sound cruel. That made it worse. He sounded organized, reasonable, and prepared. Then Harper stood. Her hands trembled around the folder, but her voice held. She showed photographs of the ditch Elias had maintained for years. She showed Dr. Lena Hart's notes proving the fair incident was not contagious. She showed that the runoff samples taken from Boone Hollow measured cleaner than water collected downstream from 2 industrial lots outside the county line. A murmur moved through the room. Gideon leaned forward. "With respect," he said, "a teenager's presentation does not override professional risk assessment." Harper's face flushed, but before she could answer, "Doctor." Lena stood from the side aisle. "No," she said, "but veterinary records do." Then she handed copies to the county clerk. For the first time that night, Gideon looked irritated. The board did not vote. They delayed the decision until after the Heritage Food Showcase, saying public interest in the farm had become material to the discussion. It was not a victory. It was only time. Outside, snow had turned to sleet. Elias and Harper walked to the truck in silence. Near the steps, Naomi Rusk caught up to them and pressed something into Elias's hand. It was a 30-day extension letter from First Prairie Bank. "I can't promise more than that," she said. Elias nodded once, unable to speak. 2 weeks later, the morning of the showcase arrived under a sky the color of old tin. By noon, freezing rain began to fall across Blackwater County. Roads glazed. Power flickered. Trucks crawled along the highway with their hazard lights blinking. Inside the fair hall, chefs and buyers set white plates on long tables beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. And in the parking lot outside, Elias Boone sat behind the wheel of his old pickup, watching ice gather on the windshield, wondering if the last meat Boone Hollow could afford to bring would even make it through the door. The freezing rain turned the Blackwater County Fairgrounds into gray ice and slush by late afternoon. Most people arrived irritated. Chefs carried insulated cases through sleet with their collars raised high. County officials stamped snow from their boots near the entrance. Farmers gathered beside coffee urns complaining about roads and weather and how nothing good ever came from December storms. Then Boone Hollow pork reached the tasting tables. Lucian Ward insisted it be served last. No distractions before it, he told the organizers. Inside the exhibition hall, long white tables stretched beneath fluorescent lights while judges and guests sampled cuts from operations across Wisconsin and northern Iowa. Most of the industrial pork looked identical, pale pink, trimmed clean, perfectly uniform, perfectly forgettable. Even Gideon Vale appeared confident again. He stood near the mid-central display speaking calmly with investors and county board members while brochures promised efficiency, sustainability, regional growth, and modern agricultural partnerships. Then Lucian carried the Boone Hollow trays into the room himself. The pork shoulder had been smoked overnight in Elias's old stone smokehouse using apple wood and oak. Thin ribbons of steam still rose from the sliced meat beneath the lights. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the smell reached them. Conversation slowed first. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. One older butcher near the front table actually closed his eyes before tasting. The flavor spread slowly across the room: deep rendered fat, smoke, dark grain, sweetness, salt, earth, and something older beneath it all. Not stronger, not richer, just alive in a way modern meat rarely felt anymore. Lucian said nothing while people tasted. He let silence do the work. At the far end of the hall, Gideon's expression tightened. One county board member quietly reached for a second piece. Another asked where the hogs had been raised. Then Milo Kessler stood from his chair holding the leather feed journal Harper had brought from the farm. The room turned toward him. "I've butchered meat in Blackwater County since 1979, Milo said, and I ain't tasted pork like this since I was a kid, helping my grandfather cut winter hogs outside Eau Claire." He opened the notebook carefully. Pages crackled softly beneath his hands. "Feed changes with weather," he read aloud. "Barley mash after first frost. Wheat grain lighter for spring hogs. Slow fermentation for calmer stock." Several chefs moved closer. Milo lifted his eyes toward the crowd. "This wasn't luck," he said. "This was 14 years of somebody paying attention while the rest of us laughed at him." Near the back wall, Elias stared down at the floorboards. Harper watched her grandfather's hands tremble slightly inside his coat pockets. Then another voice spoke up. An elderly man with watery eyes and a brewery logo stitched on his cap slowly rose from one of the side tables. "My daddy started at Hearth River Brewing in 1968, he said. "I remember Elias Boone's father hauling mash grain home before half this county paved their roads." The hall went quiet again. The old man pointed toward Gideon Vale. "That partnership existed before your company even had a name." A low murmur rolled across the room. Gideon straightened immediately. "With respect," he said sharply, "nostalgia does not solve regional food supply problems." "No," Lucien answered calmly, "but forgetting everything old doesn't solve them either." Outside, wind hammered sleet against the windows. Inside, county officials exchanged uncertain looks. For the first time since Mid-Central arrived in Cedar Hollow, the room no longer felt controlled by charts and presentations. It felt personal, human, real. One of the county supervisors finally leaned toward Naomi Rusk near the front row. "You ever actually been out to Boone Hollow?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded once. "Yeah," she said, "and I think we almost bulldozed the wrong thing." Near the entrance doors, the county clerk stepped forward carrying a sealed envelope from the zoning board. The final acquisition vote had been completed upstairs during the tasting. And suddenly, every person in the hall turned toward the envelope in her hands. The county clerk broke the seal slowly. Rain hammered the fair hall windows while everyone waited: chefs, farmers, brewery executives, reporters, butchers, board members, and people who had once laughed openly every time a grain truck backed up to Boone Hollow's fence line. Elias Boone stood near the rear wall with melted sleet dripping from the shoulders of his coat. He looked like a man already prepared to lose. "The Blackwater County Zoning Board," the clerk read carefully, "has voted to deny Mid-Central Beverage Holdings' acquisition request for Boone Hollow Farm and surrounding agricultural easements MINE." For one heartbeat, nobody reacted. Then sound rushed back into the room all at once. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone near the front clapped once before several others joined in awkwardly. Not loudly. Not like a victory parade. More like relief. Gideon Vale remained perfectly still beside the mid-central display table. His jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Maybe he understood before anyone else did that the room had changed in a way no presentation could repair. The county board had not chosen sentiment over business. They had simply realized Boone Hollow represented something the county could not rebuild once destroyed. Lucian Ward approached Elias first. "You understand this won't suddenly become easy," he said quietly. Elias gave a tired nod. Easy wasn't part of the arrangement. Outside, freezing rain turned softer as the crowd slowly filtered into the night. Reporters stopped Harper twice near the exit asking about the feed journal, the fermentation methods, and whether Boone Hollow would expand production. "We're not turning it into a brand," she answered carefully. For the first time, she sounded like somebody who intended to stay. 3 weeks later, Hearth River Brewing announced a revised agricultural partnership program requiring a portion of spent grain to remain within Blackwater County livestock operations. The official statement used words like heritage, sustainability, and regional identity. Most people understood what it really meant. Mid-Central had lost. Not completely. The warehouse project still moved forward on different land east of town. Brewery ownership remained corporate. Trucks still came and went every day beneath new logos. But Boone Hollow Farm stayed standing. Winter settled deeper over Cedar Hollow after that. The smokehouse roof still leaked near the north corner. Several fences needed replacing. Bank payments did not magically disappear. Elias's hands hurt worse in cold weather, and some mornings he moved slowly enough that Harper quietly finished chores before he could reach them. Victory had not made him young again. One Sunday afternoon in January, Daniel arrived carrying lumber in the back of his truck. Neither man mentioned the argument from weeks earlier. They simply walked to the smokehouse together and began replacing rotten boards near the curing room door while snow drifted silently through the bare trees. Around dusk, Elias stopped to catch his breath. Daniel looked at him carefully. "You should have gone to a doctor months ago." "Probably. You still hate being told what to do." "Depends who's talking." For the first time in years, Daniel laughed. Not bitterly. Honestly. Late that winter, Harper opened a fresh leather notebook at the kitchen table while wind rattled softly against the windows. The old journal sat beside it, pages warped from decades of grain dust, smoke, and weathered hands. She wrote carefully across the first page, "Boone Hollow, Year 15. Outside, headlights appeared through the early morning fog. A brewery truck rolled slowly down the gravel lane and backed once more against the old fence line. Warm, spent grain poured steaming into the cold Wisconsin air while the Berkshire hogs stirred awake inside the lots. Elias stepped onto the porch, carrying the rusted iron bell. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening to the familiar sounds, hogs grunting low in the frost, chains rattling against wooden gates, the truck engine idling softly in the dark. Then he rang the bell once, and across Boone Hollow Farm, the animals came home through the steam like they remembered every winter before this one. For a long time, places like Boone Hollow Farm survived quietly in the background of America. Small farms, old smokehouses, rusted feed bells, people who knew things they never learned from universities or corporate meetings. The kind of people who noticed weather in the smell of mud, or judge feed quality by touch instead of numbers on a screen. Most of the time, nobody paid much attention to them until they were almost gone. Maybe that's why Elias Boone's story stayed with people in Blackwater County long after the snow melted and the headlines disappeared. Not because he became rich, not because life suddenly turned easy, but because he proved that some things still carry value even when the world forgets how to measure them. Maybe you've known somebody like that too. An old farmer, a mechanic, a rancher, a grandparent. Someone people underestimated because they worked quietly instead of loudly. If this story reminded you of someone from your own life, share it down in the comments. And if you haven't already, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world tonight. These stories travel farther than people think, especially between small towns and long back roads. And if stories like this still mean something to you, stories about family farm, old wisdom, second chances, and the stubborn people who refuse to let certain things disappear, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Somewhere out there tonight, another old barn light is still burning through the cold, and somebody is still fighting to keep it on. There's a quiet kind of wisdom in people who keep showing up long after the world has decided they no longer matter. Elias Boone's story reminds us that not everything valuable looks impressive at first glance. Sometimes the things worth saving are slow, stubborn, imperfect, and easy to overlook. An old farm, a worn notebook, a family tradition, or knowledge passed down through rough hands instead of expensive schools. We live in a world that moves fast and replaces things quickly, but some of the strongest people are the ones who still believe in patience, craftsmanship, loyalty, and doing things the right way even when nobody is watching. The truth is, many of us have known someone like Elias. Maybe it was a grandfather who fixed everything with his hands, a farmer who understood the land better than any expert, or a parent who sacrificed quietly without ever asking for recognition. Stories like this matter because they remind us that dignity is not measured by money, popularity, or modern trends. Sometimes dignity is simply refusing to abandon what you know is good. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy heartfelt American storytelling about old farms, forgotten wisdom, family struggles, and small-town justice, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting down these old back roads.